Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Writer's Block. I am Jonah, the master of this particular episode, here with Erica, Murray, Cameron, Jeff. That was all one name, definitely not four, but there are four people here trying to figure out who is who. Anyway, today we are talking about setting and time period, and specifically we are talking about time period and selecting unique ones for the purposes of your story. And what I mean by this is that when most people think of setting and time period, they think about it in terms of like on the fringes of the narrative, because it's set dressing essentially. When you have a play on stage, what matters is not the props or the big backdrops or the painted murals that everything is set in front of, it's the characters. But what we're going to talk about here is how deliberately choosing a time period, whether it is one that has been done a lot or one that has not been done a lot, the process of deliberately selecting one instead of just letting one happen has its advantages. And what I mean by this is I'm thinking of two stories that at their very core are the same premise. At the very core, simple premise is dude with a samurai sword goes out and kills demons. Now, there are two stories that I think of when I think of this premise. The first one is the video game Neo, which is a fairly, I don't want to say stereotypical, but it's a very popularly done kind of story of it is set in the Edo period of feudal Japan. There's lots of samurai swords and traditional Japanese cultural clothing. There's possibly a bit of musketry if we're going for the later stages of the Edo period. But it's feudal. It's that kind of like, not ancient, but medieval kind of Japanese culture. And the other story that does this is the anime Demon Slayer, which is set in 1920s Japan, the Taisho period. And the way that this story differs from Neo is different in many ways, but the difference in time period adds so much. Because Neo is exciting. You get to see samurais running across feudal Japan rooftops killing demons. But in Demon Slayer, you get to see them do it on trains and in very industrialized eras. And the villain, instead of wearing like what you would expect a demon to wear, like samurai armor or something, is wearing a Western style suit and fedora. And so it's this kind of unique choosing of time period that can affect your story. And there are both advantages and disadvantages. So I'm going to open up the floor to everyone else and just ask, have you done this yourself? Like, what was your process of choosing a unique time period? What other stories have you seen this in? Who did them well? Who didn't do them so well? That kind of thing. So
I'll pick that up because, go ahead, Mari, my dearest. You go ahead.
Well, I feel like, I don't know, maybe I'm restricting the question a bit too much. It sounds like in that comparison, we're talking about the difference in industrialization, particularly in the development of a culture. Whereas where you look at feudal Japan versus 20th century Japan, there are a variety of not only cultural differences, but technological differences that will have an impact on this magic system as well as the characters' decisions.
Well, in that regard, that can kind of help with the question of secondary world fantasy and secondary world stories, because it's kind of hard to, set a secondary world story in an Earth time period. But if you go by the process of technological advancement, industrialization, that can give kind of a ballpark of where you're trying to set the story, even if your world has no correlation to Earth's. And I believe Erica did something like that. So you want to talk about it?
Yes, I did that. So I did a secondary world fantasy book set in a world based off the 1830s American Midwest. And I picked that time period because at the time I wrote it, I was working as a volunteer tour guide at a history center in Independence, Missouri. And I spent about 6 months there. And so I feel like I was gaining a lot of historical context knowledge because I had this unique up close and opportunity to spend a lot of time submersed in the mindset of that time period. And what really appealed to me was how rugged and dangerous everything was. There was a lot of mob warfare. There was a lot of vigilante justice. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized nobody is touching this time period. And it's really an important one in American history because somebody told me once that it takes about 200 years for any new culture to develop its own culture. And whenever people are thinking back to what the archetypal America is, and like if you wanted to have an around the world themed party and you had people come up dressed up in traditional American costume, they're not dressing up as 1600 pilgrims, not dressing up as 1770s founding fathers, they're dressing up as cowboys. because this was the 200-year mark where we got our culture. And so I think it's an important time period, but one that's very underappreciated. I don't see a lot of fantasy set in that time period. So I felt like it was something that's important to people at a very basic level. So that appealed to me to use as backdrop. But Jonah, you're talking about what some disadvantages might be of choosing time periods is because people don't expect to see fantasy set in that kind of time period. A lot of people give me first chapter feedback and they tell me, oh, so is this set in the US around the time of the Civil War? And they get it eventually if they read a couple chapters into it, but I'm referring to cities that don't exist. A lot of places are modified names of real cities and towns, but I did have to make sure I planted a couple clues up front that this is not a real place. The war that just finished is not the American Civil War, because if you're not used to seeing fantasy based off a thing, then you're going to assume it is the real thing.
Yeah, I feel like we were actually talking about this a little earlier during our writing group, which obviously we didn't record. But what people really like is to get to sink their teeth into the tropes and stories that they're already familiar with some difference, with something new. And setting is one of the great ways that you can do that. You can continue to use the same stories and the same tropes over and over again, but put it someplace new when it feels totally different, because it's not, even though we talk about setting as sort of set dressing, it does have these implications for how the story is going to play out and how people are going to act, how they're going to respond, that can actually throw tendrils deep into your story. And that's why Demon Slayer, I feel like, is so interesting, because it's not, oh, we lost Mari. Hopefully she'll come back. It's not that we haven't seen some of these things before, but we haven't seen it like that. And so I really like that comparison you made, Jonah, of it to theater, because just like you can have sumptuous costumes and lavish sets, you can also have just black box theater where it is all minimalist, and you get stories that run the gamut where they pay a lot of attention to the setting and it really informs the story a lot, and others where it is simply window dressing that is intentionally minimalized in order to focus on the character or on the plot.
Yeah, when I think of a story that does that really well in terms of minimalizing how much emphasis it puts on the time period, I would probably go with N.K. Jemisin's The Broken Earth trilogy, which is a secondary world, but she takes very important steps to establish it's post-apocalyptic. There is a certain level of technology they have, and she doesn't say anything else about it. Because at its core, the message that she's trying to convey is the time period does not matter. The level of technology they have doesn't matter, because of the geologic system that I've set up here and the character systems that I've set up, because those are more important. So even if your deliberate choice of time period is to deliberately not choose a time period, it's still important to kind of think about it, no matter what you choose to end up doing.
I think also the nature of the setting can inform the tone of the world, right? So if we have a post-apocalyptic setting, which is often used obviously in sci-fi, but I think it's cool when it's also used within the realm of fantasy, and we're going to these areas that have been destroyed, or there's just remnants of something, or there's big bones of, you know, old gods that are sticking out of the ground, that creates a sense of the world too. So I think, you know, thinking about setting in terms of what sort of tone do you want your book to have? Obviously, there's ways it can be done other ways. I mean, you know, we talk about, you know, Pratchett obviously has his with like, what is it, like a turtle and then elephants and then, you know, something. So it's like, I mean, that has a sense of, you know, gods going around, right? But even just that, you know, if we're talking about dead bones poking out of the ground of a dead god versus the idea of a turtle and then elephants and everything, right? It's like, what exactly are you looking to get across with that? And, you know, using that for, is this going to be more of a comic piece? Is this going to be more of a serious piece? Is this going to be, humanity trying to come back up to their previous glory? Is this going to be the descent of humanity into the apocalypse? And so, thinking about that, of how that would then relate to the character goals, I think you can emphasize, you can add to the story, or you can even create a conflict in the story where it's a very beautiful setting, but maybe we're dealing with people that are doing terrible things within that beautiful setting. So I think there's a lot to be gained from thinking about time period, nature of setting, and what you're looking for with that.
I think it's also interesting. I've seen a lot lately as I've been trolling Twitter for agents and publishers and editors and that sort of thing, that I've seen an increasing number of them saying, listen, don't give me fantasy stories that are in the sort of standard medieval European milieu, because I'm tired of it, right? And I do feel like the more you stick to a certain location, a certain setting, a certain time period, the more familiar it becomes, the less wondrous it becomes. And since, at least for me, fantasy is all about that sense of wonder and discovery, something that you're too familiar with becomes boring. And so it behooves us all, I think, to find time periods and locales that are less explored as we try to tell fantastic stories, simply because it helps you renew that sense of wonder and get it a little easier because it's a little less frequently seen.
Yeah, like at a certain point, it becomes a problem to even have this kind of conversation because it shows that there is a problem with the kinds of time periods we're seeing and the lack of uniqueness in some of them. And yet at the same time, like and at least in my ideal world of time periods and setting, like the stereotypical medieval Europe milieu that has become so lackluster to the publishing industry now is just one tool in the settings and time periods toolkit. And I think like until we get to that perfect world, a thing that could probably help in that regard is take the time period that has been done a lot and then find some way to either spin it or inject something new into it in order to make something that is unique, and yet you can still see the usefulness of something that has been used a lot. And I'm gonna bring up Neo again because it actually does this really well, because what Neo actually does is that it's set in feudal Japan, and yet the prologue of the story is set in Elizabethan Europe. And it talks about, the beginning of it is talking about Japan from a European perspective of these, not necessarily colonizers yet, but these people from Europe trying to make overtures to this feudal place and try and pillage their magical alchemical substances. Anyway, but the point is to hear about this setting that the entire game is going to be set in from the outside, and to see the antagonist and all of these people talking about it in ways that you would not see if the entire thing was just set in feudal Japan with just Japanese characters. That's kind of what gives the story that freshness that you wouldn't get if you were just looking at it as a standard killing demons in feudal Japan story, because it has that element of difference, that element of, I don't want to say foreignness because that doesn't sound very good, but the element of differentiation is kind of what can help lift the like blandness of tried and true fantasy settings and bring it into something new.
Just to jump in on that real quick, because I do think obviously we can reach a saturation point where people are like, oh, I've seen this before. I don't personally, I don't think that really exists for setting for me, in that I would happily watch something in a medieval time period or a sort of like Asian martial artist wuxia time period, like even though I've seen a million kung fu movies or tons of, medieval time periods or even Viking time periods or, more desert areas, there's a lot of stuff that we've seen a decent amount of, but I think many of us still looking for just what's a good and interesting story, right? And so I think just like we talked about how black box theater can exist, and I love that reference being a theater major myself, that, so much of it does come down to what are the characters, what do they want? what's opposing them, so on and so forth. And so I think the setting can add to that. So to me, I think it's a little funny, honestly, that publishers like, don't give me the medieval book. I feel like they just, they should be searching for good books. Like, it could be a medieval book, but if it's a great book, people are going to love it and people are going to buy it. So I think it's, to me personally, I don't, obviously they know what's going on with them, but I don't quite agree with this idea that we can, we should be totally moving away from something. If you've got a great story to tell in that environment, do it. I think we can add other things that create something new or different. I just want to add in two quick things with that. For instance, we're seeing a little bit of stuff like Dr. Stone coming out, where you've got someone who has knowledge of greater technology put into sort of a Bronze Age or even Stone Age environment. It is Dr. Stone after all, right? And there previously has been a lot of people saying, like, where's the fantasy in Stone Age, right? And that does feel like something that's not being used a ton. There could be more fantasy happening in Stone Age, which I think would be cool. But it's interesting that we're seeing someone injected into that world that knows about technology is then trying to turn that Stone Age environment into a more technological driven environment. And you also see this a little bit in Beware of Chicken, which is a fun story that I'm reading on Royal Road right now, which is amazing. I love it. And in that, it's someone similar who's farming in sort of like, standard cultivator story type of story. But not only does he know technology that he's trying to use on his farm, so that's one thing, getting to see this sort of mixed setting where you take someone into a setting that knows about another setting. That's number one. But then number two, I think you can also be in a relatively standard setting, but get a different perspective. I don't think it's a big spoiler here to say you get the perspective of the chicken, which is amazing. And so like, just that, if you told me a chicken's perspective in the medieval world, I haven't seen that. So I think too, something for us to consider is that setting is one way to change things, but there's other ways to change something in that familiar setting as well, which Jonah was bringing up. Like, think about that setting and think something new you could do in that setting, which I totally agree with.
I think it's definitely worth mentioning that the less work is made about a particular setting or type of setting, the more you are going to run into the burden of accuracy. I've never heard any complaints about the Disney movie Tangled, which is set in a vaguely European environment that's kind of sort of supposed to be Germany, but it's not, having Chinese floating paper lanterns in it. And if you do 5 seconds of research at all, you can tell that's not historically accurate to medieval Europe. But there's plenty of fiction about medieval Europe, so nobody cares anymore. But the instant somebody makes a story about China, they expect it to be accurate to Chinese culture, and they want it to be a China story instead of a secondary story based on China. Hopefully, once we get to the point where there's more of it, people will start to feel like they have more freedom to experiment and able to create a new world with whatever base setting they're working with.
Yeah, going off of that and going off of what Jeff was saying earlier as well, I do think that there is always going to be more to be plumbed in any setting that you use. One of the books that I am determined that I am going to write before I die is about based on a journal of a 16th century German executioner, and talking about sort of his specific experience. This is an actual real existing book from a real executioner back in that medieval period. And it's fascinating. It's stuff that I have never seen talked about or displayed in any fantasy book I've ever seen. And so I really want to dig into that. But it's very much that medieval milieu that we're supposed to be avoiding, but you've never seen that. So I think in the most familiar of settings, all you got to do is look at the person you don't usually look at, and there's a whole new fresh set of stories to be told.
Quickly on the subject of what Erica was talking about with accuracy, I have 2 thoughts on that. And the first one is that is partially a can of worms subject that we as white Americans are not really poised to discuss accurately in the sense that there is a certain amount of delicacy that needs to be treated of marginalized cultures and cultures that are like have been used for caricature in the past. But also another thought I have is accuracy is important, obviously, but also accuracy, once again, highly depends on the difference between secondary world and like on Earth. Because like if I'm writing, like if I've written a novel set in 19th century Imperial Russia, like that is a real place with a real history and a real culture. And so I definitely do need to get that right to an extent. Do I need to get the like details of how many tassels are on Tsar Nicholas's military suit? Probably not, but I probably do want to remember that the Napoleonic Wars happened in 1815 and not in 1845 when my story is taking place, because that could be difficult. And that's basically my thought on that, is that accuracy does matter. The line of where it starts to not matter anymore can be both blurred and different depending on the kind of story you're telling and the kind of time period you are describing. But I think it always matters to an extent. And when you're writing something that is more familiar to your readership, you can get away with more kind of making it different because they're already on board with the setting, because you don't need to explain it to them what it is. With Tangled, we know that it's kings and queens and princesses and castles. We know the story of Rapunzel. We aren't really going to get tied or tangled up. We're not going to get tied up on the details of the technological advancement or the time period setting as much as if it were set in, say, I don't know, just set in a time period that we are less familiar with, or if it was taking the fairy tale to a different time period deliberately. So I think it all goes back to the familiarity we have with certain time periods over others, and that requires a certain level of accuracy, so that if these unique time periods that aren't used as much become more mainstream, we aren't getting them wrong.
I think also too, it depends on who's your readership for that thing. So obviously you're talking a fair bit about historical fiction, right? And historical fiction kind of like, I feel it cuts both ways, because you got the advantage of you can look stuff up, right? But then it's also like you need to look stuff up, right? So it's like, yay, I got stuff to draw on, but I better get stuff right. So I think, people that are reading historical fiction, one of the reasons they're probably reading it is similar to the reason someone might read a story about someone who's a pilot or whatever. They're interested in learning about that time period. So it's like, I feel like I'm learning something, but I'm also getting a fun story, right? And so I think those people want that accuracy, just like someone that's, reading a crime novel, all the research that they do into, how guns work or something, if someone's a gun nut. I remember going to LTU conference, and one of the writers was talking about how he always makes sure to get all the gun stuff exactly right, because he knows a lot of his readers are reading because they want to read about that, they want to know it, or that someone, if he doesn't, they'll immediately tell him right away. And so because of that, and yeah, feel free to say it, Jonah, who's that?
I just didn't want to interrupt you. That is, I believe, Larry Correa.
Yeah, that's totally him. So anyway, I was just going to say, I think with historical fiction, right, there is something about recognizing who wants to read that work and what do I need to do to deliver that expectation. Whereas people that are watching Tangled, which is such a good movie, I think that there's not, the people that are watching that for a different reason, right? They're going in for the enjoyment, the fun, the songs, the slapstick, the animals. Oh my God, the horse in that movie. I think maybe one of my favorite ones. I feel like we do a whole episode just on that. So I think that's important to consider as well, because I think certain readers will forgive aspects if they're getting other aspects that they want. And then if, we're talking about this for writers, then as a writer, it's important to prioritize, like, what can I'm not gonna say get away with, but what can I invest less in because the readers care more about these other things that I could be focused on.
I think one way you can make sure you're allowed to get away with things is just throw accuracy out the window and just give really strong signals that this is supposed to be comedy. I like works like Flintstones and the movie adaptation of Ella Enchanted, which are what I call mock modern. You've read the book Ella Enchanted by Gail Carson Levine. It's a typical medieval European milieu, and it's a Cinderella retelling, but in the movie Ella Enchanted, Ella's going to the marketplace with her stepsisters, and she's going down an escalator. You go, wait a second, why do we have an escalator in medieval Europe? And then it pans to below the staircase, and there's a guy standing there turning a crank all day, every day, so people can have a mall escalator in a medieval setting. And that movie gets a lot of criticism for departing from the source material, as any book to movie adaptation does, but The one thing I like about it better than the source material, which I do really, really love that book, and there's some things that are lost in the adaptation, is that we get that mock modern vibe. That's really fun because you can tell it's not supposed to make sense and you're messing around with it on purpose.
I'm sorry, I'm just coming real quick about this. So one, I recently watched Enchanted because my wife was like, we need to watch this movie. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Though part of me does think that they might have done that sort of style of movie because I think there's a lot of lack of trust in Hollywood, or at least there used to be, that a fantasy movie people would watch or be interested in. Obviously, we've seen that changing with things like Game of Thrones and stuff like that out there. But overall, if you look at the history of the number of movies that have some sort of fantasy or medieval element, there's not that many in comparison to a lot of other things, especially not at a high budget or high end. So I guess I just want to say, fun movie if people want to watch it. But I am curious as well how much of what they did there was influenced by like a lack of trust of, well, we need it to be kind of modern so people will go see it. I just wonder how modern the book is because I haven't read the book.
All right, so I have one more quick spiel I want to give, but we're kind of starting to run low on time. So does anyone else have any final thoughts before I start to wrap this up?
I feel like we could go all night, but no, please.
Oh yeah, we can always go all night. I'm asking, does anyone have any concise, reasonably length thoughts before I give one last little tangent?
Never. No.
Okay, so
no.
Okay. So being the English graduate, not English major anymore, English graduate with a history minor, being that kind of person that I am, I do want to address like the literary aspect of time period, especially for all the people who specifically want to write literary fiction like I am starting to do. One of the things that time period can do for your story is give a sense of not necessarily literary theme on its own, but give a sense of literary atmosphere to your story. And what I mean is picking, if you're writing literary fiction based on Earth, like we're just going to go with that for now because that's what I know, that's what I'm writing. If you're picking a time period for your literary story, whether it is fantasy, whether it is genre fiction or not, picking that time period can do a lot to help establish the foundation for whatever literary themes you're trying to convey. For example, in the novel I just wrote, my protagonist, I have two gay protagonists who end up together. Choosing to write that in 19th century Russia as opposed to 19th century England gives a very different kind of plot line and a very different kind of examination of the issue of gay protagonists in Russia than it would do in England because those were two very different cultures. I study 19th century European history. Choosing a time period like that for my story gives me loads of ability to explore issues related to that time period that still affect history and politics today, like nationalism, the rise of democracy and the fall of monarchy, that kind of thing. So in addition to being able to just get an agent to be interested in your work by choosing a time period that isn't medieval fantasy with dragons, picking a time period can also help give a foundation for explorations of deeper meaning, deeper themes, deeper issues that you don't even necessarily have to examine consciously if you don't want to. Just being able to have a unique time period gives lots for the English graduates and English scholars like me to analyze and get excited over without even you needing to do much. So just go out there, pick your time periods, but do it deliberately. Whatever you choose to do, whether it is do a unique spin on something more well-worn, whether you choose something that is completely unused before and you have to do more work explaining what it is, pick deliberately, because picking something deliberately instead of just going, I suppose I could do this, is probably the most powerful choice you can make as an author, no matter what aspect of the story you're doing. So this has been the Writer's Block. Thank you everyone for viewing this lovely episode, and we will see you next time, blockheads.